And so the question that we want to talk about this morning is, how can we move from hurting to healing? I mean, how can we vent out our pain and our frustrations and our anxieties and not be complaining? How can we put all these things that have us stirred up inside, how can we put them aside and begin the healing process? I mean, that's the question, right? And you know, many times I think we try to be strong. I mean, that's our society. Stiff upper lip, tough it out, you know. Nobody likes to listen to a complainer. And yet when we keep all this stuff in and we keep it quiet and we have this stiff upper lip, you know, all it does is fester inside and we get just the pressure just builds. And so that's a good question, is how can we work from that point to healing? And this pandemic that we're in just absolutely magnifies this situation, because regardless of how you feel about the pandemic, it has turned our lives upside down. People are suffering financially from isolation, health-wise. You know, we're all wrestling with something new in this time. And so, if you would, in your chat box, take a moment and yeah, it's okay to type during church if you will, but type in, you know, are you dealing with something that you're just not wanting to complain about, but it's bothering you? If it's not too sensitive, put it in the chat box and I'll respond. I'll respond and we'll have a conversation about that. Well, you know, I think we can learn from history. If we go back to ancient Israel, the Hebrews, they came out of Egypt, they went to the promised land, they built the big temple in Jerusalem, and then the Babylonians and then the Assyrians and the Egyptians, you know, just these other massive armies came in and basically destroyed them. And they're dealing with this destruction, and then many of them get exiled to a foreign land. I mean, they're pulled out of their own home and taken somewhere else. And so the early Hebrews, they knew what it was like to be turned upside down, to be dealt, you know, a pretty rough hand, to have a lot of pain and a lot of stress in their lives. And so they developed a special form of prayer, if you will, called a lament. And in a lament, we cry out and we share our pain and our frustrations and our anxieties and our injustices. Now, you might be wondering, that sounds like complaining to me, but there's a difference. Because with laments, we're talking to God and we're saying, God, we're hurting. You know, be with me, help me in this. And when you're complaining, you're talking against God. For example, when the Hebrews crossed the Red Sea and they were wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, they complained to Moses, you know, you took us out of Egypt and now we're going to starve to death or we're going to die of thirst, or, you know, they complained about multiple things. Well, that's complaining, right? And that's talking against God, if you will. I got to get caught up here. It's complaining against God. But in a lament, what we're doing is we're complaining and talking to God. And you know, the most famous lament, if you will, would be the words of Jesus Christ on the cross. And from Mark 15:34 we hear, at 3 o'clock Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you know, that was not original words. What Jesus was doing is he was reciting a lament, which happened to be the 22nd Psalm. And so he was calling out to God, God, why have you forsaken me? And so he was talking to God. He was working on that relationship with God, versus complaining, which is just, complaining tears us away from God, and laments bring us closer to God. And so another way to look at complaining versus lament is complaining festers inside because you're just stirred up over something and you're just gnawing away at it. But when you lament, you're basically throwing your cares on God and you're saying, God, I have this pain. And so if you would, take a minute and make use of that chat box again and And tell me what if you got any confusion between complaining versus laments. I know it took me a while to really sort it out because it's a little bit subtle. But let's look at Psalm 22, because this is what Jesus was referring to. Verses 1 and 2, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now that's what Jesus said on the cross. And then it goes on from there. Why do you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer. And oh by night, but I find no rest. And I think a lot of times that's how we feel today, right? We say, where is God in this? Where is God in this pandemic? Where is God in my life? Any particular struggle you might have. And so what we're doing is we're calling to God and saying, God, hey, come on, pay attention here, help me out. And so the other thing to keep in mind when we think about the Psalms, we think about the laments, when we think about the early Hebrew writing, it's a poetry. And so it's not like a Betty Crocker cookbook where it's really factual. What the Hebrews tended to deal in word images and dramatic language because they wanted to make an impression. And so a lot of this is what we would consider to be a little bit on the dramatic side. So let's look at, we just read the first two verses of Psalm 22. Let's look at, go on to verses 3 and 4. And remember, the last words were, God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you left me? Now here's what they continue with. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. And so now what we're doing is we're telling God that we trust Him. We don't understand it. We wish we weren't suffering. But we know that He will take care of us because He took care of our ancestors. And so to you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and they were not put to shame. And so maybe it's starting to get a little bit clearer, the difference between complaining, which is talking against God. It's a negative emotion, versus laments where you're just calling out, man, I'm hurting. Talk to me, God, help me out. And so it's important that we're honest with God when we're hurting and when we have frustrations and anxieties. It's not complaining when we talk to God and we say, God, I'm really frustrated, I'm really concerned, I'm really anxious about COVID, about a medical procedure, about a loved one who is perhaps not doing well. And so when we trust God, when we talk to God, it strengthens our relationship with God. We go closer to God versus complaining, which is just the exact opposite. It really tears us apart. But the benefits really to the laments, in this message this morning, I'm just kind of introducing the concept, but the benefits goes much deeper in our society. We tend to avoid the whiners and complainers, and so being able to voice our frustrations is just so much healthier. The other thing, one of the other things about laments that's important is listening to somebody else's story. In other words, if we have the attitude that we don't want to listen, then the other person can't get it out of their system, so to speak. And so what we have are silos of people, people standing by themselves in isolation, not able to voice their hurt and their pain. And in our society, it's so helpful to be able to listen to one another, but typically what we do is we don't want to hear about the pain. We've got a culture in this country where it's all good, right? And I'm strong and I can make my own way. And we literally don't want to hear pain. And I know I'm that way a little bit, because you hear the national news, for instance, and this latest hurricane that just went through Louisiana again, and it wiped out all those homes again, and The wildfires are crazy in California. You know, I can't even imagine having you know, all of Kalamo Township on fire. You know, that's crazy. And so when we don't voice our pain, we lose the ability to empathize with people. We get numb. We say, well, I just don't want to hear it. And so we don't let others tell their story. We don't let others start that healing process. Now, if we go to Paul's letter to the Romans in Romans 12, verse 14, Paul says these words: we should rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And so Paul is encouraging us to engage in lament, to listen to other people's pain and share with them talking to God and struggling with God. And as a community of believers, then there's corporate lament. In other words, we can lament on our own. You know, Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? But we, in a group, whether it be a church or a small group or whatever, you know, we can engage in, God, we are struggling, we are hurting, we need your love, we need your strength. And so what I'd like to do at this point is go to Psalm 56 as an example, because one of the problems I've had, you know, one of the struggles I've had is looking at some of these ancient words and saying, they don't mean anything to us today. And yet when you understand a little bit more of what's behind the words, at least for me, the words have become a lot more helpful, a lot more real. They have a lot more meaning. So in Psalm 56, I just want to hit on some portions of Psalm 56. Now, Psalm 56, tradition has it that King David wrote this. Be gracious to me, O God. People trample on me. Now, King David was the most powerful king in the entire world at that time, and yet people are trampling on him. O Most High, when I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. And so here we hear this, the sorrow and the pain. People are trampling on him. He's had a setback of some kind. And yet, when I'm afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. For you have delivered my soul from death and my feet from failing. And so if you kind of get a sense for what's going on here, when we think about our life, when let's say you've had a personal setback of some kind, I don't know, you know, dealing with school kids in school in this situation, I'm not sure how we would deal with that. Sandy and I are past that point, so my hat's off to the families that are dealing with that. But we can read these words and remember that it's poetry, and so it tends to be grandiose, dramatic, and say, but still the emotion is there. Be gracious to me. People trample on me. I put my trust in you. And so what we're doing is we're growing in faith, we're building our trust with God, and we're drawing closer. And so now, next Sunday, what we're going to do is there's some deeper ways where this lament process helps us grow, helps us start this healing process. And so, for example, as Christians, oftentimes we have this mental picture that if we're good, our life would be great, and if we're not so good, that's when we have problems, and which is completely wrong. So there's ways where laments helps us through the troubles in our lives as followers of Christ. And so now, if you got a minute, in the chat box, if you have any questions on this or comments, make a comment or a question or something in the chat box, and I'll try to respond in a timely fashion and get back with you and let you know what my thoughts are. And so now what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and read Psalm 56. And if you just listen to it, and just kind of savor that. Be gracious to me, O God, for people trample me. All day long foes oppress me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many fight against me. O Most High, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I am not afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they seek to injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps. As they hope to have my life, so repay them. In wrath cast down those peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings. You have put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your record? Then my enemies will retreat in the day I call. I know this, for God is with me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust, I am not afraid. What can a mere mortal do to me? My vows to you I must perform, O God. I will render thank offerings to you, for you have delivered my soul from death, my feet from falling, so that I may walk before God in the light of light. It's awesome words, and I recommend that you perhaps look that up in your Bible and grab a cup of coffee or soda, whatever you like to drink, and just kind of work your way through that and kind of think about that. Meanwhile, if you got any thoughts or questions, put a note in the chat box, and we'll talk more.